Chapter 5. A scattered Israel. He that is not with me is against me, and he that gathereth not with me scattereth abroad. Luke 2:24. The scriptures and sermons of the prophets abound with a multitude of reasons for the saints to gather, but nowhere have they mentioned advantages in remaining scattered. On the contrary, all of the prophets have listed numerous evils that result from living among the worldly and ungodly. The spirit and power of gathering filled the souls of all the prophets of God. Those prophets who were the most spiritual felt that power the most. In this dispensation, that spiritual giant Heber C. Kimball said, "Yes, I feel many times to weep and am sorrowful, and I can hardly sleep at night. And if I had Gabriel's trump, I would speak to the saints of all nations, and I would say, gather, gather, and do not wait even for a handcart to be made. I feel this in my soul. Do the world believe it? Do the Latter-day Saints believe it? No." J.D. 7:168. The reason the Lord filled the prophets with such a burning desire was to save the souls of the saints. The perils of remaining in Babylon were too numerous and too dangerous for those who were scattered. Some of these dangers are: 1. Temptations of the worldly. The alluring affluence of the world was the last and most enticing temptation that the devil offered to Christ. It is a power so effectual that nearly all men are swayed by its snare. In this last dispensation, the devil has devised new and more influential temptations which he never employed before. These temptations are propagated through television, motion pictures, radio, books, magazines, and every form of advertising media. Even the wisest saints may be overcome by these temptations. The question is often asked by sectarian ministers, why could you not live in New York, Liverpool, or London, as well as going to Zion? Because we should be in the midst of sin and wickedness and abomination, and it would be very difficult, while so situated, to keep from being polluted by the evils which reign upon the face of the earth at the present time. Wilford Woodruff, J.D. 12:280. 2. Wicked environments. Even if the saints who are scattered abroad could avoid the temptations, they would still remain the victims and prey of the wicked. Thieves, criminals, and villains continually seeking for ways and means of overtaking unwary souls. Righteous people seek to be delivered from such a wicked environment. Those who have embraced the gospel in foreign lands sigh for deliverance, and the hope of this deliverance is the only ray of light that burns in their souls, and that gives them joy, although they live with their whole lives oppressed. This beam of gladness has found its way into their souls through the principles of the gospel, and hence they are less oppressed in their feelings than many others. A hope springs up in their bosoms that the time will come for their deliverance from the oppression under which they groan. Daniel Wells, J.D. 11:186. 3. Evil associations for the youth. The standards of the world are never the same as they are for the saints. A true Latter-day Saint will find raising children among the ungodly a most discouraging effort. He must raise his children in a much different path than those of their associates. A worldly society literally mushrooms with immorality, dope, pornography, profanity, and a host of evils. Raising righteous children requires an almost unsurmountable effort to prevent them from being destroyed. Today's society hosts drinking, smoking, dirty jokes, narcotics, and fashions that are topless and bottomless, and these are rapidly degenerating every nation. Righteous parents would seek every means of delivering their children from such associations. Now, you who wish to hire out with the wicked and mingle with the ungodly, does it suit you to hear the name and character of the deity profaned, and every principle of propriety violated? If you go to the gold mines, or wherever the wicked are, you will hear the name of that being whom you recognize and acknowledge as your Savior blasphemed and taken in vain, and the name and character of the Almighty vilified and abused. Can you bear this? Does it suit you to have your ears saluted with such language and your spirits contaminated with such society? I would not associate with those who blaspheme the name of God, nor would I let my family associate with them. By this you may know whether you are in the path that leads to life and salvation. Brigham Young, J.D. 12:219. 4. Reverencing unrighteous men. The most honorable men of the earth are the prophets, patriarchs, and apostles of the Lord. But the world praises and honors its athletes, politicians, movie stars, and the wealthy. Men may be knaves, barbarians, corrupt and wicked, and yet be hoisted to the most honored positions in the society of the world. The worldly are honored for their temporal accomplishments, and society is taught to honor them for it. For a saint to live and raise his children in Zion where men of God are honored would be a blessing of unestimable worth. Honoring spiritual men and to live near them is one of the prime objectives of the gathering of Israel. The world always mistook false prophets for true ones, and those that were sent of God they considered to be false prophets, and hence they killed, stoned, punished, and imprisoned the true prophets, and these had to hide themselves in deserts and dens, and caves of the earth, and though the most honorable men of the earth, they banished them from their society as vagabonds. Whilst they cherished, honored, and supported knaves, vagabonds, hypocrites, impostors, and the basest of men. Joseph Smith TPJS, page 206. 5. Lack of protection. The history of the Church has proved the necessity of the saints to dwell together and offer each other protection. Often without provocation, the fury of mobs has burst out against the people of God. Their strength and protection rested in their numbers and unity. By being scattered, the righteous may not only suffer from mobs, but also from unjust politicians, lawyers, doctors, and businessmen, who might rob them of their property, their possessions, or their liberties and rights. Wickedness and righteousness are in direct opposition. The devil is opposed to God, and God is opposed to the devil. All the heavenly hosts are opposed to wickedness, and all persons who are wicked are opposed to the heavenly hosts. This will be so as long as there are wicked people in existence. It does not matter how smooth they may be in their outward appearance, or how sociable they may be in their conversation. They, with their tongues, may make you think they are the most gentle, polite, civilized, and moral people on the face of the earth, while within their hearts lurks a poison which would destroy the saints of the living God. As this has been the case in every former age and dispensation, so it is now. Hence, the latter-day saints in every part of the globe are commanded to gather out from the midst of wickedness, corruption, and priestcraft, and every abomination that exists, and assemble themselves in one place. For what purpose? That we might be separated from the world and its corruptions, which would otherwise work our temporal and spiritual destruction. Orson Pratt, J.D. 12-303. 6. Counterfeit education. The world advances illegitimate ideals and pagan principles. The saints would be raised in an educational environment that stems from atheistic teachers and absurd theories. From years under such schooling, it requires a near miracle to exclude such propaganda from the tender minds of youth. The end result of modern education has produced a demoralized and lawless society. Men teach their own theories, ideas, and opinions, and hence confusion and disorder prevail in the world. Hence, in order that God may have a people who will carry out his designs and accomplish his purposes, he has introduced the gospel, and under its influence people have been gathered together to this land, as we see them here today, and as they are to be seen throughout the length and breadth of this territory. The world, as I have said, is full of confusion, and there will be worse confusion by and by. John Taylor, J.D. 24-200. 7. Temporary marriages. The marriages of men and of God are entirely different. The parents of the children of Zion seek friendships for their children, which will result in worthy and honorable marriages. Today's society is advocating trial marriages and common law relationships and group marriages, which usually do not last even for time. The righteous seek eternal marriages for their children. If they live among the worldly, their children will be attracted to the standards of Babylon. Living in a scattered condition in the world is an enticement for marrying out of the faith of practice, which has always been forbidden of God. Neither shalt thou make marriages with them. Thy daughter thou shalt not give unto his son, nor his daughter shalt thou take unto thy son. For they will turn away thy son from following me, that they may serve other gods. So will the anger of the Lord be kindled against you, and destroy thee suddenly. Dut. 7:3-4. 8. Dissolved family associations. People who live in a scattered condition will find the blessings of family gatherings nearly impossible. Family interests, paternal objectives, and parental responsibilities are all nearly uprooted by being separated. The spiritual work between the living and the dead is one of the most important and comprehensive labors of Zion. The gathering of saints to one place is necessary in order to preserve their genealogies, and to secure to them those inheritances, the title to which must be substantiated by legitimate records, kept in the archives of the house of God. Whenever God has had a people, he has been careful to instruct them to keep an accurate record of marriages and the issues of marriage, from Adam to Noah, and from Noah to Abraham, and thence to David down to Jesus Christ. The genealogy must necessarily be preserved. Says David, God setteth people in families as a flock. He arrangeth them in families, but if these families intermarry with those who do not keep the laws of God, nor conform to his ordinances, the records of genealogy are soon obliterated from the knowledge of men, and the proof of a legitimate title to inheritance is thereby extinct, and unless saints are gathered out from the midst of unbelievers, they are more liable to intermarry and become alienated from the ordinances and covenants of the Lord. Mill, star 9309. 9. Deterioration of temporal and spiritual welfare. During times of illness, financial trouble, or some demoralizing experience or crisis, the saints are less able to rely upon other members of the church. The world's welfare is generally obligatory, cold and lifeless, which destroys incentive. When saints can aid each other, it brings them closer together spiritually and temporally. When persons manifest the least kindness and love to me, oh, what power it has over my mind, while the opposite course has a tendency to harrow up all the harsh feelings and depress the human mind. Joseph Smith, TPJS, page 240. 10. Building the World Society. Members of the church who live scattered must use their income, efforts, and talents in sustaining those societies and kingdom of the world. To live there usually requires adopting the unions, sales gimmicks, customs, and business practices of the worldly, thus lending support to those kingdoms. Therefore, little or no time can be devoted to building up the society of the saints. We are not gathered together to build up the kingdom of this world. The voice of God has not called us together from the uttermost parts of the earth to build up and enrich those who are diametrically opposed to his kingdom and its interests. Brigham Young, J.D. 12-153. 11. Obedience to Gentile law and rule. The principles of heaven are not practiced among the nations of the world. Scattered saints are forced to trade, bargain, and deal with Wall Street sharks and businessmongers. Many saints are required to work in businesses which are unworthy of the association of a Mormon. Many good Mormons are compelled to work for liquor, tobacco, or much less worthy enterprises. They may be required to work on the Sabbath or to practice dishonest business principles. We are here to promote the principles of heaven and advance the purposes of the Almighty and no others. And when you spend $1 to build up any other power or kingdom than the one which God has established, you are doing wrong, and you will find it out sooner or later. Sometimes when I think of these things I am very strenuous in my feelings, and some might think that I was whipping them to it just as we have been whipped into being an independent people. We are gathered together to sanctify these bodies, to deal, act, transact, and do everything we do in the love of God, and in the fear of God, for the building up of his kingdom, and to his name's honor and glory. Brigham Young, J.D. 11-288-290. 12. Obedience to lesser laws. While living among the worldly, we are subjected to the principles of the world. Therefore, we are unable to live or practice the laws of God. While Israel lived among the Egyptians, they could not live the laws of God. While their minds were tradition to Egyptian rules, they had great difficulty receiving and obeying the higher laws of God. Today, the profit margin and marketing practices of the world keep the saints from understanding and living the laws of God. The priesthood in the last days has to be manifested in sufficient power to bear off the kingdom of God triumphant, that all Israel may be gathered and saved. If all Israel will not be sanctified by the law which their Moses first offers them, they will peradventure receive a law of ordinances administered to them, not according to the power of an endless life. Men will be saved in the last days as in former days, according to their faith and willingness to receive the word of God and walk in it. F. D. Richards, J.D. 1, 321. 13. Subjection to the spirit of disunity. When Latter-day Saints are commanded by God to gather but refuse, they become subject to another spirit. Those who refuse the spirit of gathering and unity are influenced by the spirit of the world. The saints who reject the call to be gathered will eventually lose faith, lose the spirit of the Lord, and eventually will apostatize. The elders go forth and preach the gospel to the nations. They baptize the people, hunt them up from place to place. Yet, if you take the names of those who have been baptized, have the 1/4 ever been gathered? No. Is not this strange? Do they keep the faith and stay in the midst of the wicked? No, they do not. Look at the people who are here, the few that have gathered, and then look back at the branches you came from. How many have gathered? Where are the rest of those who compass those branches? It is true that occasionally one will remain and keep the faith for many years, but circumstances are such in the world that they eventually fall away from it, if they remain there. Brigham Young, J.D. 11-101-2. 14. Opposing the saints of God. Mormons who live in different nations may become subjected to laws which would place them in positions of jeopardy to other Mormons. In the event of war, saints may be forced to kill other saints. During World War II, there were Mormon bombardiers who dropped bombs on the homes of other saints, and perhaps Mormons shot Mormons on the battlefronts. Since wars are continuing to increase among the nations, so will this perilous evil. You may take the Methodist Society, the Presbyterian Society, the Baptist Society, the Episcopalian Church, the Roman Catholic Church, or any other you please, and you will find that motives of a political character will separate them and make them enemies to one another, and make them take up arms against one another, fight one another, and shed each other's blood. They not only seek to destroy each other, but they all pray to the same God to help them to do so. There is nothing strange or singular in this, for there is no motive, principle, or power to cement or unite them together, further than a sort of fancied religion, which does not possess the principles of union. For instance, in some of the great wars that took place in Europe some years ago, one of the last with which we are the most familiarly acquainted was between Russia, England, and France. Who took up sides in the struggle? There was the Greek Church under the Russians, Protestant England, Catholic France, and the Mohammedan or Turk fighting against each other. The Catholics were Christians, the Protestants were Christians, the Russians were of the Greek or Christian Church, the Turks were Mohammedans, all worshippers of the same God, under different forms. These were arrayed against each other in deadly strife, all praying to the same God to give them power over their enemies, and their enemies were also Christians. Then they went to slaying and destroying each other. Let us notice the difficulties between France and Italy against Austria. In this case, there were two Catholic powers engaged against another power which was also Catholic. Religious considerations do not confine or control them in the least. They fought just as hard to kill their fellow Christians as the Mohammedans or any other people would fight to kill their enemies. They were all in the same church, all partaking of the same sacrament, all believing in the same doctrines and worshiping the same God. How has it been in the United States? Precisely the same. John Taylor, J.D. 10-124. 15. Perils of destructions. When the curses and wrath of God are poured out upon disobedient nations, none are exempt. Both saint and sinner are subject to the vengeance of God's wrath. Only the rebellious would refuse to gather after God had given such reasons to gather. Will we exert ourselves to relieve those brethren that are scattered abroad? We believe ere long that the vengeance of the Almighty will be poured out upon the inhabitants of the whole earth. Peace having been taken from the earth, men thirst for each other's destruction, and in their conflicts and destructive wars, our brethren and sisters who desire to emigrate to these peaceful vales may be overwhelmed and have to suffer with the multitude of the wicked, unless we stretch forth our hand and use our means for their deliverance. G. A. Smith, J.D. 9-159. 16. Disobeying a commandment. Any member of the church who refuses to gather to Zion is acting in disobedience to a commandment of God. To refuse to gather with the saints is acting in rebellion to God, and such will suffer his displeasure. You there in your own lands learned that this was his true church, his true kingdom established upon the earth as he predicted by the mouth of his servants, and you felt anxious to be gathered with the rest of the saints that had the same testimony with you. Hence you gather not only from choice, but by actual commandment. We do not gather here merely for the sake of being together, but it is because the same God who revealed the Book of Mormon by his servant Joseph, the youth of whom I have spoken, that same boy, received another revelation which is published in the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, which I now hold in my hand, commanding the Latter-day Saints to gather out of all nations of the earth to this American continent. Hence you came here because you had received the Holy Ghost. You have come here because you knew this work was true. You have come here that you might fulfill the commandment which God gave near the time of the rise of this church, in relation to the gathering of his saints from among all the nations and kingdom of the earth. Now this great work of the last days never could be accomplished without this gathering together of the saints. Orson Pratt, J.D. 21-134. 17. God's law of segregation. The law of segregation is one of God's laws, but mongrelization is an opposing law. God has always separated his people from other nations and bloods. There were segregations in the pre-existence and segregations in every dispensation on earth, and there will be separations in the heavens which are to come. The ordinances of the church and institutions of God's house cannot be carried into execution in a land belonging to aliens from the Commonwealth of Israel, because aliens from God will not have the Lord to rule over them. They consider that the laws of God set 2 against 3, and 3 against 2, the father-in-law against the son-in-law, etc. And so do they have this effect, and always will have it, until the saints are separated from their adversaries. Before there can be anything like a true, godlike, peaceful millennium, a separation must take place between the righteous and disobedient. Even as a shepherd divideth the sheep from the goats, even so must God's will be done with friends and foes on earth, like as in heaven. Mill, Star, 9-310. 18. The test of sacrifice. The latter-day saints who will not gather have been tempted and overcome. The saints who gather prove their faith in God and his word. It is a trial of sacrifice and will test the saints to see if they are willing to give up their lands, their work, their friends and relatives, to be gathered with the people of God. It is one of God's simplest tests to see who will be obedient to his revelations. Every true believer of this gospel is anxious to gather to the home of the saints. I think I am safe in saying that if there was a highway cast up from England to the shores of the continent of America, There are men who would be willing to measure the ground with their bodies to reach this place. Even this does not tell their anxiety to be here. It must be seen in the spirit, to know it as it really is. We are agreed in gathering the saints, as well as in the initiatory ordinances of the gospel of peace. It might be said that the tug of trials has commenced when the saints begin to cross the plains to this place. This temporal duty puts all their spiritual attainments to the test. Brigham Young, J.D. 10:18, 19, and 20. The burial place and the resurrection. The final resting place of all the prophets was considered sacred. They spoke of dying in Zion as one of their last requests. Sir, we feel the very same extraordinary interest in depositing our very bones in the land of Zion that the patriarchs formerly felt when they commanded that their bones should be removed to the country and burying place which God had designated. If there is enthusiasm in this sentiment, sir, it is the enthusiasm of patriarchs and prophets that kept the divine mandates, and knew well the order of the resurrection, and the necessity of having their bones laid on the identical land, that should afterwards be their possession and inheritance for ever and ever. Did not the Lord apportion off the land of Canaan to the 12 tribes to be their inheritance forever? And shall not the 144,000 in the latter days be equally tenacious to possess the very inheritance that was promised them to be a perpetual possession in time and eternity? Their bones, like the precious valley of dry bones, will be the guardian care of angels, and in the resurrection stand up like a consolidated army, while the disobedient and ungodly shall be scattered and driven as chaff before the wind. The aged and infirm among us fervently desire to carry their bones, while animated with life, to the land of Zion, as an expression of their faith in the promise of God, that He will resurrect them and plant them in that same heavenly country which they now seek. What Canaan was to ancient saints and prophets, the land of Joseph will be to the saints and prophets of the last days, and more abundantly. Orson Spencer's Letters, Milliseconds 9:310. I would esteem it one of the greatest blessings, if I am to be afflicted in this world, to have my lot cast where I can find brothers and friends all around me. But this is not the thing I referred to. It is to have the privilege of having our dead buried on the land where God is appointed to gather His saints together, and where there will be none but saints, where they may have the privilege of laying their bodies, where the Son of Man will make His appearance, and where they might hear the sound of the trump that shall call them forth to behold Him, that in the morn of the resurrection they may come forth in a body, and come up out of their graves and strike hands immediately in eternal glory and felicity, rather than be scattered thousands of miles apart. There is something good and sacred to me in this thing. The place where a man is buried is sacred to me. This subject is made mention of in the Book of Mormon and other scriptures. Even to the aborigines of this land, the burying places of their fathers are more sacred than anything else. Joseph Smith, TPJS, page 294. Whether in life or death, the true saints have always sought to be gathered. The reasons are numerous, and the blessings are more than multiplied when they fulfill the call to gather to Zion. There are very few blessings for Israel in a scattered condition.